The great crystal chamber of Zerion Prime sparkled with lights from 1,000 different worlds. Jake Morrison adjusted his blue diplomatic uniform and looked around the massive hall where representatives from across the galaxy gathered for another council session. He had been Earth's ambassador for 3 years now and knew this place well. The air hummed with translation devices working in hundreds of languages while beings of every shape and size took their assigned seats. Dr. Lisa Carter sat beside him, her tablet filled with notes about alien biology and customs. She always came prepared for these meetings, knowing that understanding other species helped with negotiations. Commander Ryan Beck stood behind them both, his military uniform crisp and his hand resting near his ceremonial weapon. The three humans looked small among the towering insect-like mantoids and the floating gas beings from the nebula worlds. Council Speaker Veltar raised his scaled hand for silence. The Zephyrian leader was old even by his species' standards, with silver markings that showed his age and wisdom. His voice carried clearly through the translation system as he called the session to order. Jake noticed something different in the speaker's tone today, something that made him pay closer attention than usual. The first few agenda items passed normally. Trade disputes between mining worlds, border adjustments in the outer systems, and funding for new exploration missions. Jake participated when human interests were involved, offering Earth's perspective on matters that affected them. Lisa provided scientific input when biological issues came up, and Ryan spoke briefly about security concerns in disputed territories. Then Veltar announced Resolution 847 Delta, and the chamber fell silent. Jake had not heard of this resolution before, which was unusual. Most major decisions were discussed in advance through diplomatic channels. He felt Lisa tense beside him as the details appeared on their screens. The resolution was simple, but devastating. It declared humanity a destabilizing influence on galactic peace and order. The document listed several complaints against human behavior in council space. Human unpredictability was mentioned first, followed by their rapid technological advancement that disrupted established trade patterns. The resolution criticized human interference in conflicts between other species, even when that interference prevented wars. Delegate Corthan of the Altarian Empire stood to speak. His tall, thin frame cast a long shadow as he gestured toward the humans section. He spoke about the recent Kepler mining crisis, where human negotiators had stepped in to prevent a war between two mining companies. While the humans had succeeded in stopping the fighting, their solution had disrupted trade routes that had existed for centuries. Many established businesses had lost profits because of the new arrangements. The representative from the Crystalline Consortium complained next. She spoke in clicking sounds that the translators turned into accusations about human entrepreneurs. These humans were undercutting established monopolies with new technologies and innovative solutions. They offered better services at lower prices, which the consortium saw as unfair competition rather than progress. More delegates stood to voice their concerns. The thermal nomads complained that humans were too emotional and made decisions based on feelings rather than logic. The aquatic dominion said humans were too aggressive in pursuing their goals. Even some of the younger species that usually supported humanity remained silent during the debate. Jake requested permission to respond, but Veltar denied the request. The speaker explained that this was not a debate but a formal declaration. The council had already made its decision through private votes over the past weeks. Jake realized with growing horror that this had been planned in secret, without any human knowledge or input. The final vote was called. Numbers appeared on the great display board as each delegation cast their decision. The result was overwhelming. 847 votes in favor of the resolution, only 23 against. Most of the opposing votes came from newer species that had recently joined. The council with human sponsorship. The established powers had spoken with one voice. Veltar announced the terms of humanity's expulsion. All human citizens, colonies, and military assets had to withdraw from Council space within 72 standard hours. Any human presence after the deadline would be considered an act of aggression against the entire Council. The threat was clear. Leave. Peacefully or be forced out by military action. The chamber erupted in surprised chatter as delegates discussed the unprecedented decision. Never before had the Council expelled an entire species from their alliance. Jake sat in stunned silence for several moments, processing what had just happened. 3 years of careful diplomacy and relationship building had been destroyed in a single vote. When Veltar called for order again, Jake stood and requested permission to address the Council one final time. The speaker looked uncomfortable but granted the request, perhaps feeling some guilt about the secret nature of the proceedings. Jake walked to the central podium where so many important speeches had been given over the centuries. His words were simple and dignified. He thanked the Council for their clarity in expressing their wishes. He acknowledged their decision and formally announced humanity's acceptance of the expulsion. He renounced Earth's membership in the Galactic Council, effective immediately. Then he said something that would be remembered long after the session ended. "We came in peace, seeking partnership. We leave in peace, wishing you prosperity." Jake returned to his seat and gathered his papers. Lisa and Ryan followed his lead, collecting their materials and personal items. The 3 humans walked out of the chamber in complete silence, leaving behind the ceremonial gifts they had brought and the cultural artifacts that had decorated their diplomatic section for years. The chamber fell quiet as the human delegation disappeared through the exit. Many delegates had expected angry protests, desperate negotiations, or even threats of retaliation. The calm dignity of the human departure left them unsettled and uncertain. Some began to wonder if they had made the right choice, but it was too late to change their votes now. Admiral Patricia Hayes stood on the bridge of the UES Constellation, watching as priority signals flooded in from across human space. The message from Ambassador Morrison had reached her only 30 minutes after the Council vote, but she had been expecting it for months. Protocol 7 was not a plan they had hoped to use, but humanity had learned long ago to prepare for every possibility. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its thoroughness. Every human citizen, every human facility, and every human improvement in Council space would be removed within the deadline. Nothing would be left behind that could benefit those who had chosen to expel them. Patricia activated the emergency broadcast system and began sending coded instructions to human commanders throughout the galaxy. Captain Alex Turner received his orders while orbiting the 3rd planet in the Proxima Centauri system. Below him, 3 million human colonists lived in cities they had built over decades of hard work. The planet had been barren when they arrived, but human engineering had transformed it into a garden world with breathable air and flowing water. Now, all of that work would be undone in less than 3 days. Alex called his senior staff together and explained the situation. The evacuation would be challenging, but not impossible. Humanity had faced worse crises before and survived through careful planning and mutual cooperation. Transport ships were already moving toward Proxima from the nearest human worlds, their cargo holds empty and ready to receive evacuees and equipment. The evacuation began immediately. Families packed their most precious belongings while work. Crews dismantled the infrastructure they had spent years building. The orbital platforms that controlled weather and communications were broken down into portable components. The fusion power plants that provided clean energy were carefully shut down and prepared for transport. Even the atmospheric processors that had made the planet livable were packed up and loaded onto cargo ships. Dr. Kevin Martinez supervised the evacuation of the Andromeda Medical Center, the most advanced hospital in this sector of the galaxy. The facility treated patients from dozens of species, many suffering from rare diseases that only human doctors knew how to cure. Kevin felt sick as he watched medical equipment being packed into transport containers, knowing that people would die without these treatments. The alien patients were transferred to other facilities where possible, but many conditions simply could not be treated anywhere else. Kevin personally spoke with each patient who would have to find alternative care, explaining the situation and providing what help he could. Some patients begged him to stay, offering to pay any price for continued treatment, but Kevin had his orders and his duty to his own species. Engineer Sophie Williams led teams throughout the system, removing human improvements from alien infrastructure. The spaceports had been redesigned by human engineers to handle larger ships and process cargo more efficiently. Sophie's teams carefully removed the human additions, leaving the original alien designs intact, but far less capable than before. The tech communication networks were particularly complex to undo. Human-designed relays had boosted signal strength and improved data transmission across multiple star systems. Removing these improvements meant that many worlds would lose contact with the broader galaxy until they could develop their own solutions. Sophie tried not to think about the isolation and confusion this would cause. Transport ships arrived from human space in an endless stream, their crews working around the clock to load evacuees and equipment. The ships were packed beyond normal capacity, with families sharing spaces and personal belongings reduced to whatever could fit in a single bag. Despite the crowded conditions, there were no complaints. Everyone understood the necessity of leaving quickly and completely. Captain Ben Rodriguez commanded one of the largest evacuation vessels, a converted cargo hauler that now carried 15,000 refugees. His ship also held the complete archives of the human diplomatic mission, including detailed records of every treaty, trade agreement, and cultural exchange program humanity had participated in over their decades in council space. The most painful part of the evacuation was retrieving the cultural gifts. Human artists had donated paintings, sculptures, and musical compositions to the Galactic Museum on Zerion Prime. These works had been displayed as examples of human creativity and shared heritage with other species. Now they had to be collected and removed, leaving empty spaces in the museum galleries. Ben personally oversaw the removal of a massive sculpture called Unity that had stood in the museum's central hall for 8 years. The piece had been created by human artist Rachel Stone to represent the cooperation between different species in the galaxy. Museum director Kenthal watched sadly as human workers carefully dismantled the sculpture and loaded it onto transport vehicles. The speed and efficiency of the evacuation surprised many alien observers. Humans had prepared for this possibility far more thoroughly than anyone realized. Every facility had emergency protocols, every family had evacuation plans, and every piece of human technology was designed to be quickly dismantled and moved if necessary. What had taken decades to build was being undone in hours. As the deadline approached, the last human ships prepared to leave Council space. Captain Rodriguez's vessel was among the final departures, carrying not just refugees but also the last representatives of human presence in this part of the galaxy. He stood on his bridge and looked back at the worlds humanity was leaving behind, knowing they would never return under these circumstances. The evacuation was completed with 37 minutes to spare. Every human citizen had been safely removed from Council space, along with every piece of equipment, every improvement, and every cultural contribution they had made. The aliens who remained found themselves in a suddenly emptier and less capable galaxy, though few realized it yet. Admiral Hayes received the final confirmation signals from across the evacuation zone. Protocol 7 had been executed perfectly, with no human casualties and no equipment left behind. She felt proud of her species discipline and organization, but also sad about the end of their relationship with the Council. Humanity had genuinely wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. The silence that followed the human departure was more profound than anyone expected. Communication networks that had operated flawlessly for years began showing strain. Trade routes that had been optimized by human logistics experts became congested and inefficient. Medical facilities struggled with diseases they had not seen since human doctors had developed new treatments. Most importantly, the neutral zones between hostile species were now unguarded. Human peacekeepers had maintained stability in these regions through patient diplomacy and strong defense. Without their presence, old conflicts began to stir again, like coals waiting to burst into flame. The galaxy had become a more dangerous place in just 3 days, though the full consequences would not be apparent for weeks to come. The first crisis began only 4 days after the last human ship left Council space. Commander Vexal of the Corvan Republic received an urgent message while patrolling the Kepler system. Helios collective miners had resumed operations in disputed territory, claiming that human withdrawal had voided all previous agreements. The peace treaty that Jake Morrison had negotiated just 6 months earlier was falling apart without human mediators to maintain it. Vexal tried to contact the neutral monitoring station that humans had established between the 2 mining zones, but received only static. The station was gone, dismantled and removed like everything else humans had built. Without neutral observers to verify mining claims and resolve disputes, both sides began making aggressive moves to secure valuable asteroid fields. The situation escalated rapidly. Corvan patrol ships confronted Helios mining vessels, demanding they withdraw from contested areas. The Helios miners refused, arguing that the original agreements were invalid without human oversight. Within hours, warning shots were fired, and both sides called for military reinforcements. On Xerion Prime, Council Speaker Veltar convened an emergency session to address the growing crisis. The great chamber that had seemed so united just days before now buzzed with nervous energy and worried conversations. Delegates who had confidently voted to expel humanity were beginning to realize the complexity of the problems they had inherited. Trade. Disruptions were appearing throughout Council space. The thermal nomads had built their entire economy around human-designed cooling systems for their ships. These systems required specific maintenance protocols and replacement parts that only human engineers fully understood. Without this support, thermal nomad vessels were breaking down in increasing numbers, stranding crews in dangerous situations. Captain Zeth Ron of the thermal nomad fleet sent desperate messages to the Council, requesting technical assistance for his failing ships. His people were dying from heat exposure as their cooling systems failed one by one. The original alien manufacturers of the equipment could not provide adequate support since humans had improved the designs far beyond the original specifications. The Aquatic Dominion faced similar problems with their underwater cities. Human engineers had upgraded life support systems that kept millions of aquatic beings alive in their deep ocean colonies. These improvements had seemed minor at the time, but now proved critical to the city's survival. Without human maintenance, oxygen recycling systems were becoming unreliable and pressure regulation was failing. Delegate Marcia of the Aquatic Dominion stood before the Council with obvious distress. Her usually calm demeanor was replaced by urgent concern as she described the crisis facing her people. 3 underwater cities were reporting life support failures, and their own engineers could not repair the human-designed improvements quickly enough to prevent casualties. The medical crisis was even more severe. Dr. Elena Foster had been the only specialist in the galaxy capable of treating Corvan scale syndrome, a genetic disease that affected millions of Corvan citizens. Her research facility on the neutral world of Haven had been completely evacuated, taking with it decades of medical knowledge and treatment protocols. Corvan families watched helplessly as their children suffered from a disease that had been manageable just days before. The medicines that Dr. Foster had developed were no longer being produced, and no other doctor in Council space understood her treatment methods well enough to continue her work. Hospital ships carrying desperate patients tried to follow the human evacuation route, but were turned away at the border of human space. communication networks throughout the galaxy began experiencing massive failures. Human-designed relay stations had formed the backbone of long-range communications between distant worlds. The removal of these relays created dead zones where entire star systems lost contact with the rest of civilization. Emergency services could not coordinate responses to natural disasters, and merchant ships found themselves isolated and vulnerable to pirates. The Galactic Trade Commission reported a 23% drop in interspecies commerce within the first week of human departure. Human merchants had served as neutral intermediaries between species that refused to deal directly with each other due to cultural or historical conflicts. Without these intermediaries, many trade relationships simply ceased to exist. Administrator Zixel of the Trade Commission presented his findings to an increasingly panicked council. The economic impact was spreading like a virus through the galactic economy. Supply chains that had operated smoothly for decades were collapsing as key links disappeared. Worlds that depended on imported food and medicine were facing shortages that could soon become critical. The neutral zones between hostile species were becoming dangerous again. Human peacekeepers had maintained stability in these regions through a combination of diplomatic skill and military deterrence. Without their presence, old enemies began testing each other's resolve, and minor incidents threatened to escalate into major conflicts. The crisis in the Kepler system was just the beginning. Ancient territorial disputes that had been settled through human mediation were being reopened by aggressive species looking to gain advantage. The mantoid hegemony began moving ships toward borders that had been established through human negotiations. The gas giant alliance started claiming mining rights in systems they had previously agreed to share. Council sessions became exercises in crisis management rather than governance. Every day brought new reports of system failures, economic collapse, and diplomatic breakdowns. The delegates who had so confidently voted to expel humanity now found themselves overwhelmed by problems they did not know how to solve. Veltar tried to maintain order during the increasingly chaotic sessions, but his authority was being questioned by delegates who blamed him for the current crisis. The Zephyrian Empire, which had led the effort to expel humanity, found itself isolated as other species began to openly regret their decision. The most troubling aspect of the crisis was its acceleration. Problems that should have taken months to develop were appearing in days. The galaxy had become far more dependent on human contributions than anyone had realized. Humans had quietly become essential to the functioning of interstellar civilization, and their absence was creating cascading failures throughout Council space. Emergency measures were proposed and quickly implemented, but none seemed adequate to address the scope of the crisis. Temporary solutions failed as quickly as they were put in place. The Council had voted to remove what they saw as a disruptive influence, but instead had removed the foundation that held their civilization together. As reports continued to pour in from across the galaxy, one fact became increasingly clear to everyone in the Council chamber. They had made a terrible mistake, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The quiet dignity of humanity's departure was looking less like defeat and more like the calm before a storm that would reshape the entire galaxy. 3 weeks after humanity's departure, the Kepler mining crisis had evolved into something far worse. Fleet Admiral Corthan watched from his command ship as Corvin and Helios vessels exchanged fire over the disputed asteroid fields. What had started as mining disagreements had become a full military conflict with both sides mobilizing their entire fleets for war. The neutral zone that human peacekeepers had maintained was now a battlefield. Ships from both factions prowled the area, attacking anything that belonged to their enemies. Civilian mining vessels fled the system as military forces took control of the most valuable asteroids. The careful balance that Jake Morrison had negotiated was completely destroyed. Admiral Corthan tried to follow the peace protocols that humans had established, but without human mediators to interpret the complex agreements, Both sides found loopholes and excuses to continue fighting. The Corvin Republic claimed that Helios had violated the mining quotas first. The Helios Collective insisted that the withdrawal of human oversight had voided all previous agreements. The war was spreading beyond the Kepler system. Allied species on both sides were being drawn into the conflict as old alliance networks activated. The Mantoid hegemony supported the Corvin Republic, while the Gas Giant Alliance backed the Helios Collective. What had been a local mining dispute was becoming a major galactic conflict. Communication failures were making the crisis worse. The Galactic Communication Network had suffered complete breakdown in 12 outer rim sectors where human relay stations had been removed. Emergency coordination between different species was nearly impossible, and false rumors spread faster than accurate information. Captain Neltar of the rescue ship, Bright Hope, tried desperately to coordinate aid for civilian populations caught in the expanding war zone. Her ship carried medical supplies and evacuation equipment, but she could not communicate with ground forces to determine where help was needed most. The human-designed emergency protocols that had saved countless lives during previous crises were gone. The medical situation had become catastrophic. Dr. Elena Foster's research into the quantum plague had been on the verge of a major breakthrough when she was forced to evacuate. Now the disease was spreading unchecked through 3 star systems, with Council medical facilities unable to replicate her work or continue her treatment programs. Dr. Chenal, the leading Altarian physician, stood helplessly in his laboratory as the plague spread through his home system. He had worked closely with Dr. Foster for 2 years and understood her research better than anyone else in Council space, but even he could not recreate the complex treatment protocols she had developed. The human approach to medicine was fundamentally different from anything other species used. The plague victims filled hospitals across the affected systems. The disease attacked the nervous systems of most humanoid species, causing progressive paralysis and eventually death. Dr. Foster's treatments had not only stopped the progression, but actually reversed the damage in many patients. Without these treatments, the death toll was climbing rapidly. Economic collapse was accelerating throughout Council space. The human financial institutions that had managed currency exchanges and facilitated complex multi-species transactions were gone. Without these services, interstellar commerce was grinding to a halt as different species struggled to conduct trade using incompatible monetary systems. The Crystalline Consortium, which had complained about human competition, now found their own trade networks failing without human intermediaries. Their rigid business practices could not adapt quickly enough to fill the gaps left by human merchants. Profit margins that had seemed threatened by human innovation were now meaningless as entire markets disappeared. Trade routes that had operated efficiently for decades became chaotic bottlenecks. Human logistics experts had optimized shipping, lanes, and cargo handling procedures throughout Council space. Without this expertise, transport times doubled and shipping costs skyrocketed. Many worlds that depended on imported goods began rationing supplies as deliveries became unreliable. The thermal nomads faced a humanitarian crisis as their cooling systems continued to fail. Captain Zethran's fleet was stranded in the Vega system, where 17 ships had suffered complete cooling failures. His crew members were dying from heat exposure, and the traditional nomad solution of constant movement was impossible with broken ships. Desperate for spare parts and technical assistance, Zethran made a decision that would shock the entire galaxy. He ordered an attack on a human colony ship that was passing through neutral space. The ship, UES Pioneer under Captain Steve Morgan, was carrying evacuees from the abandoned colonies and posed no threat to anyone. The attack was a complete disaster for the thermal nomads. The human ship's defensive capabilities far exceeded anything the Council had realized humans possessed. Captain Morgan's vessel easily repelled the assault, disabling the attacking ships without causing casualties, but demonstrating a level of military technology that surprised everyone. The incident sent shockwaves through council space. Humans had left peacefully and shown no aggressive intentions, but they were clearly capable of defending themselves effectively. The ease with which the human ship handled multiple attackers made many species reconsider their assumptions about human military capabilities. Council Speaker Veltar convened another emergency session to address the growing list of crises. The great chamber that had once been filled with confident delegates now hosted desperate leaders searching for solutions to problems they did not understand. The vote to expel humanity was looking more catastrophic with each passing day. Reports continued to pour in from across the galaxy. The Aquatic Dominion's underwater cities were experiencing critical life support failures. The gas giant Alliance's atmospheric processors were breaking down without human maintenance. The insectoid collective's hive ships were losing navigation. Capability as human-designed guidance systems failed. Each crisis created new problems as the interconnected nature of galactic civilization became apparent. The failure of communication networks prevented coordination of aid efforts. The collapse of trade routes meant that replacement parts and emergency supplies could not be delivered where needed. The medical crisis was spreading because quarantine. Procedures required technology that humans had taken with them. Delegate after delegate stood to describe the deteriorating situation in their home systems. The Progressive Coalition representative begged for emergency aid that the Council could not provide. The Outer Rim Alliance reported that several member worlds were considering declaring independence rather than remain part of a failing galactic government. The most troubling development was the complete breakdown of diplomatic protocols between different species. Human ambassadors had often served as neutral mediators in disputes between council members. Without this mediation, old grudges and cultural misunderstandings were causing new conflicts to emerge throughout the galaxy. The session ended in chaos as delegates argued over emergency measures and assigned blame for the crisis. The coalition that had voted to expel humanity was fracturing as member species pointed fingers at each other. Some delegates openly called for immediate attempts to contact humanity and negotiate their return, but political gridlock prevented any decisive action. As Veltar looked out over the increasingly empty chamber, he began to understand the true scope of their mistake. Humanity had not just been another council member. They had become the connective tissue that held galactic civilization together. Their removal was not causing simple inconvenience, but systematic collapse of everything the Council had built over thousands of years. 2 months after the human exodus, Council Speaker Veltar faced the most difficult decision of his long political career. The reports on his desk painted a picture of systematic collapse that threatened the very existence of galactic civilization. The Kepler War had spread to 6 star systems, the quantum plague had killed millions, and economic activity had dropped by nearly half across council space. The pressure from his own people had become unbearable. Zephyrian colonies were suffering from the same problems affecting everyone else, and public opinion had turned sharply against the leadership that had pushed for human expulsion. Veltar's political allies were abandoning him one by one as the consequences of their decision became undeniable. Ambassador Kral'eth of the Progressive Coalition had been pushing for diplomatic contact with humanity for weeks. The young Altarian diplomat had opposed the original expulsion vote and now led a growing faction demanding immediate action to restore relations. Veltar finally authorized a secret diplomatic mission, hoping to begin negotiations before the situation became completely irreversible. Kral'eth assembled a small delegation of representatives from species that had maintained friendly relations with humanity. The group included Dr. Yen Al, who had worked closely with human medical researchers, and Trade Minister Voran, who understood the economic implications of the crisis better than most council members. The delegation traveled to the edge of human space in an unarmed diplomatic vessel, broadcasting messages of peaceful intent. They were met by the UES Defender under Captain Nicole Adams, a veteran officer who had served on the Border Patrol for 15 years. Captain Adams was polite but firm in her response to the unexpected visitors. The human captain explained that any official communication with former Council species must go through proper diplomatic channels. Since humanity had withdrawn from the Council and renounced all previous agreements, no such channels currently existed. The delegation would need to request formal meetings through individual species governments, not through the Council that had expelled them. Kraleth tried to explain the urgency of the situation, describing the crises that were destroying Council civilization. Captain Adams listened respectfully, but made it clear that humanity's position had not changed. They bore no ill will toward any Council species, but they had chosen to pursue their own path after being rejected by the galactic community. The captain did offer one small hope. Trade agreements might be possible in the future, but only on a bilateral basis between humanity and individual species. Each government would need to approach humans separately and negotiate their own terms. The days of humanity accepting junior partner status in Council affairs were over. While the diplomatic mission struggled with human intransigence, the situation in Council space continued to deteriorate. The thermal nomads had split into three competing factions, each claiming leadership of their people and fighting over the remaining functional cooling systems. Their once proud fleet was scattered across a dozen systems, with ships breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The quantum plague had spread to 5 star systems and was showing signs of mutation that made it even more deadly. Without Dr. Foster's research to guide treatment efforts, Council medical facilities could only watch helplessly as the disease evolved beyond their ability to treat. Entire planets were being quarantined to prevent further spread, creating humanitarian crises as supply lines were cut. The most shocking development came from long-range scout reports about human activities beyond Council space. Humanity had not retreated into isolation as many had expected. Instead, they had expanded aggressively into unexplored regions, establishing new colonies and forming alliances with species that had never been part of the Council. Captain Rex Ale of the scout ship Deep Explorer brought back reports that stunned the Council leadership. Human space had actually grown during the 2 months since their expulsion. They had contacted dozens of non-Council species and established trade relationships that were apparently thriving. The humans were not suffering from their exile, but seemed to be prospering. The most disturbing news was that several minor Council species had requested permission to leave Council space and seek protection from humanity. The peaceful farmers, an agricultural species that had always been loyal Council members, formally announced their intention to withdraw and join the human alliance. Their representative explained that the Council could no longer provide the security and stability that their people needed. Council meetings had become exercises in damage control rather than governance. Each session brought new reports of system failures, refugee crises, and diplomatic breakdowns. The Great Chamber that had once hosted representatives from across the galaxy now felt empty and desperate as member species struggled with problems they could not solve. The economic situation was becoming critical for many worlds. The Outer Rim territories were particularly hard hit, as they had depended heavily on human-mediated trade relationships. Without access to human financial systems and logistics networks, these regions were becoming isolated from the galactic economy. Food shortages were appearing on worlds that had specialized in manufacturing rather than agriculture. The complex trade networks that had allowed planets to focus on their most efficient industries were breaking down without human coordination. Rationing was becoming common, and some worlds were reporting actual starvation in their more remote settlements. The breakdown of communication networks was making coordination of aid efforts nearly impossible. Emergency services that had relied on human-designed protocols and equipment were failing at critical moments. Natural disasters that should have been manageable were becoming catastrophes as different species could not coordinate their rescue efforts. Veltar found himself presiding over the disintegration of everything his civilization had built over thousands of years. The Galactic Council had been the greatest achievement in known history, bringing together hundreds of species in peaceful cooperation. Now it was falling apart in months because they had expelled the one species that had made it all work. The political pressure was becoming unbearable. Several major species were threatening to withdraw from the Council entirely if the leadership did not take immediate action to restore relations with humanity. The Zephyrian Empire itself was facing internal rebellions as their colonies suffered from the same crises affecting everyone else. Emergency sessions became daily occurrences as the Council tried desperately to address each new crisis. Proposals were made and quickly abandoned as the scope of the problems became clear. The infrastructure that had taken millennia to develop was too complex to be quickly repaired or replaced by species that had never fully understood how it worked. The most painful realization was that humanity had been far more important to galactic civilization than anyone had understood. They had not just been another member species, but had become the foundation that supported everything else. Their quiet efficiency and willingness to solve problems had made them essential in ways that only became apparent after they were gone. As Kralith returned from his failed diplomatic mission with news of humanity's inflexibility, Veltar finally understood the full scope of their mistake. The humans had not left in defeat but in dignified rejection of a system that had treated them as junior partners rather than equals. They were building something new and better, while the Council was left to face the consequences of their short-sighted decision. 6 months after humanity's quiet departure, the great chamber of Zerion Prime stood nearly empty. Council Speaker Veltar looked out over rows of vacant seats that had once held representatives from across the galaxy. The Galactic Council still existed in name, but its power and influence had crumbled along with the civilization it was meant to govern. The Kepler War had finally ended, not through peace negotiations, but through mutual exhaustion. Both the Corvin Republic and the Helios Collective had fought themselves into economic collapse, their fleets destroyed and their colonies devastated. The asteroid fields they had fought over were now empty graveyards of broken ships, valuable to no one. The quantum plague had burned itself out in some regions while completely depopulating others. 3 star systems were now quarantined indefinitely, their worlds empty except for automated distress beacons that continued broadcasting to an increasingly empty galaxy. The medical breakthrough that might have prevented this catastrophe remained, locked in research that had departed with Dr. Elena Foster. President Karen Hughes stood before the cameras in New Geneva, the capital city of Haven Prime, humanity's new home world far beyond Council space. Her message was broadcast throughout known space, reaching even the most isolated systems through communication networks that humanity had built independently of Council infrastructure. Her words were measured and dignified, expressing genuine sadness at the dissolution of galactic civilization while emphasizing humanity's commitment to their new path. She spoke of the Human Colonial Alliance, a growing federation of species that had chosen cooperation over domination, partnership. Over hierarchy, the alliance was thriving in ways that amazed even its founders. Dozens of species that had never been part of the Council had eagerly joined the human-led organization. Trade flowed freely between member worlds, protected by human defense networks and facilitated by human financial systems that had been improved. During the months of exile, Dr. Lisa Carter, now Director of Xenological Research for the Alliance, announced a breakthrough that sent shockwaves through the remnants of Council space. Her teams had completed development of quantum medicine techniques that could not only treat the plague that had devastated Council worlds, but potentially cured dozens of other diseases that had plagued the galaxy for centuries. The research had been completed using resources and partnerships available only outside Council space. Species that the Council had never contacted or had dismissed as primitive had contributed knowledge and materials that proved essential to the breakthrough. The galaxy was far larger and more diverse than the Council had ever realized. Individual. Council species began reaching out to humanity for bilateral agreements, abandoning the pretense of council unity. The Altarians were first, desperate for medical aid for their plague-affected populations. Their ambassador arrived at Haven Prime with a massive delegation and authority to negotiate any terms necessary to secure human help. The Altarian negotiations were successful but expensive. Humanity drove hard bargains, demanding not just payment, but formal apologies for the expulsion vote and guarantees of equal treatment in any future agreements. The Altarians accepted these terms gladly, knowing that their people would die without human medical assistance. The Aquatic Dominion followed next, seeking technology transfers to repair their failing underwater cities. Their delegation was even more desperate than the Altarians, as entire populations faced death from life support failures. The humans agreed to help, but insisted on complete access to Dominion research facilities and a 50-year exclusive trade agreement. Each agreement was negotiated separately, with humanity maintaining strict control over the terms. There would be no return to the previous system where humans provided essential services while being treated as junior partners. Every species that wanted human assistance would have to acknowledge humanity as an equal and pay market prices for services. The thermal nomads were among the last to approach humanity, their pride damaged by the failed attack on the UES Pioneer. Captain Zethron himself came to Haven Prime, offering his personal submission to human authority in exchange for cooling system repairs that would save his people. The humans accepted his surrender gracefully but insisted on technological concessions that would prevent future aggression. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Council struggled with problems they could not solve. Communication networks remained fractured. Trade routes stayed disrupted, and medical crises continued to emerge. The species that had voted to expel humanity found themselves increasingly isolated as their former allies abandoned the failing organization. The Progressive Coalition formally withdrew from the Council, taking with them the last pretense of unity among the younger species. Their leader, Ambassador Kraleth, announced that his people were seeking admission to the Human Colonial Alliance, where they hoped to find the stability and prosperity that the Council could no longer provide. Council. Speaker Veltar found himself presiding over an organization that existed mainly on paper. The Great Chamber that had once hosted the largest interstellar government in history now held only a few dozen delegates representing species too proud or too isolated to seek human assistance. The Zephyrian Empire, which had led the effort to expel humanity, was facing internal revolution as their colonies demanded new leadership. Veltar's own position was becoming untenable as his people blamed him for the catastrophic decision that had destroyed their civilization. He had become the symbol of galactic failure. In his private quarters, Veltar often reflected on Ambassador Morrison's final words in the chamber. "We came in peace, seeking partnership. We leave in peace, wishing you prosperity." He finally understood that humanity's quiet departure had not been an admission of defeat, but a statement of independence from a system that had treated them unfairly. The humans had offered to be partners in building something greater than any single species could achieve. When that offer was rejected, they had simply gone elsewhere and built something better without those who had dismissed them. The Council's loss was not just humanity, but the future itself. Reports continued to arrive about human expansion beyond the old borders of known space. The Human Colonial Alliance was discovering new worlds, contacting new species, and building trade networks that dwarfed anything the Council had achieved. They were creating the future, while the Council was trapped in the ruins of the past. The final session of the Galactic Council was held on a cold morning when only 12 delegates remained. Veltar formally dissolved the organization that had governed the galaxy for thousands of years, acknowledging that it no longer served any useful purpose. The great experiment in interstellar cooperation was over. As he walked out of the empty chamber for the last time, Veltar carried with him a message that had arrived that morning from President Hughes. The message was simple and generous. The door remained open for individual species to join the Human Colonial Alliance based on mutual respect and equality. The age of humanity seeking council approval was over, but the age of human leadership had just begun. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson about the value of partnership and the cost of prejudice. Humanity had departed silently when rejected, but their absence had spoken louder than any words. They had been the foundation of galactic civilization, and without them, everything had crumbled into dust and regret.